When we walk into a modern art museum and see a piece titled Untitled Number 7, which might just be a canvas painted completely white, and are then told it's worth a fortune, our first reaction is likely confusion or even suspicion. We might ask ourselves, is this a scam? Some sophisticated tool for money laundering? Or the art world's version of the emperor's new clothes? But at the same time, we've had the complete opposite experience. We might be kept up all night by the ending of a film, or be deeply moved by a song's melody that echoes in our minds long after. In those moments, we have no doubt that we've touched something incredibly real and profoundly important. We cherish these works of art so much. Personally, I've always wanted to figure out what art truly is, partly to articulate why the great works feel so precious to me, and partly to be able to offer precise criticism of the ones that aren't. And today, that is what we will try to do. The situation with art today is this. Economic development has dramatically lowered the cost of creation. Tools like paints, guitars, and cameras have become more widespread and affordable for most people. At the same time, the cost of learning has also decreased. Video platforms are filled with free educational resources, making it easier than ever for more people to acquire artistic skills. Furthermore, the cost of sharing has plummeted. The ubiquity of smartphones and video platforms has made creating and communicating more convenient and frequent, providing everyone with the material means to be an artist. As society has become more progressive, the environment for expression has grown more open and free. This has allowed for greater diversity in both creation and thought. Now, breakthroughs in AI technology are redefining the very boundaries of creation. Its emergence has led many to feel that traditional art forms are losing their meaning, sparking a debate. Is it still necessary to learn the traditional skills of painting, writing, or composing music? These conditions have led many to the realization that anyone can be an artist. Simultaneously, seeing the collapse of the traditional order, many feel the sentiment that art is dead. And yet, in our daily lives, we continue to use the word art, which shows that the concept itself has not lost its vitality. For this reason, it is more necessary than ever for us to have a clear understanding of this phenomenon we call art. To solve this puzzle, I want to start with a phenomenon that might seem trivial at first glance: the peculiar way the word art is used in everyday language. When I'm watching short clips of soccer matches, I'll see video titles like The Art of Dribbling or a Maestro in the Midfield, a true artist. In the comments below, you might read something like, that kind of offensive play is pure art. It doesn't stop there. Some books that teach you how to make money are titled The Art of Investing, and some that teach public speaking are called The Art of Public Speaking. In these examples, is the word art being overused? These things aren't considered classic works of art. So is using the word here a desecration of its meaning? Quite the opposite. I believe these examples are precisely what can reveal the very essence of art. So how do they do that? To begin with, soccer, investing, and public speaking all share one thing in common. They are all highly complex activities. In soccer, in a split second, a player has to judge the position, direction, and speed of teammates and opponents. They must also assess the characteristics of each player and determine the most advantageous move in a confrontation, all to make the right choice. Although this decision involves countless factors, it is made in an instant, through a holistic, intuitive sense. Moreover, higher-level intellectual skills like the ability to read the game can only be acquired through the constant accumulation of experience. Investing is even easier to understand. It inherently requires a person to have a comprehensive understanding of society, as it relates to economics, politics, culture, human nature, and more. No one can guarantee that their investments will be profitable, but it is certainly not a game of pure chance. We are searching for patterns within an incredibly complex environment. Public speaking also requires us to consider many factors, such as the content being delivered, the control of rhythm and pace, the audience's engagement, and so on. My explanations here are just brief sketches of their complexity, and they may not be perfectly precise. But it's clear they are all complex undertakings, even if their degrees of complexity differ. We can all probably appreciate this. It is nearly impossible to describe the rules of these domains with a clear mathematical formula. When we do apply mathematics to these complex fields, we typically have to break them down into numerous dimensions, quantify many different metrics, look for correlations, and use tools from probability and statistics to draw conclusions. While we currently lack a good way to evaluate whether soccer is more complex than public speaking, we can define it this way. Anything whose rules cannot be expressed through simple, clear logical concepts is, by its nature, complex. And complexity isn't a simple binary. It exists on a spectrum. We can list many more examples of such complex domains: warfare, management, interpersonal relationships, classroom teaching, and so on. And you'll notice that if you add the art of before any of these words, it sounds like a plausible title for a bestseller. The art of war, the art of management, the art of socializing, the art of teaching. In fact, if we take a step back, we'll see that our lives are primarily surrounded by these kinds of complex phenomena. On the other hand, things that are simple and clear, like the carefully designed elimination of variables in a scientific experiment, the rules of Go, or the quantification of time by a clock. These are all unnatural things, created by humanity through immense effort. Therefore, the world we inhabit is, first and foremost, structurally complex, with blurred boundaries and infinite extensions. And we know very little about it. Before the advent of science, in order to survive in this world and interact with it effectively, humans needed to understand it. We needed to build cognitive frameworks. Early religions may have helped people explain the things for which answers were seemingly unattainable. And besides religion, perhaps the other major tool playing this vital role was art. Next, I'm going to lay out my theory in more detail. I'll start by classifying our brain's knowledge systems based on their complexity, dividing knowledge into two categories: well-structured domain knowledge and ill-structured domain knowledge. Then, I will analyze the characteristics of the artistic phenomenon and explore the relationship between art and ill-structured domain knowledge. So, first things first, what are well-structured and ill-structured domain knowledge? What I'm about to explain might sound a little abstract, but if we can get a handle on it, the question of what is art becomes much easier to answer. Well-structured domain knowledge is knowledge that can be expressed through simple, clear logical concepts. Examples include how a clock tells time, the rules of a traffic light, or the game of Go. Their rules and the context in which they apply are explicit and unambiguous. Ill-structured domain knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge that cannot be captured by simple, clear logical concepts. The boundaries of its application are fuzzy. So, how do we acquire this kind of knowledge? We learn it through concrete, specific cases. When dealing with such cases, this knowledge is flexible and open. It involves multiple representations, multiple interpretations, multiple analogies, and multiple dimensions of analysis. Let's use a practical example to explain this. A manager leading a team of employees. The team itself constitutes a specific case, as does a project that needs to be completed. If the manager wants to become an excellent leader and acquire deep management knowledge, they must do so by accumulating experience in the actual process of managing this team. They need to identify patterns and, from there, form a multidimensional understanding of the group, building a rich and complex knowledge structure. Furthermore, these cases can sometimes have obvious differences, while at other times they appear very similar. However, even the slightest differences cannot be dismissed as trivial details. Ignoring them can create significant problems when trying to find a solution. For example, imagine a new member joins the team. The on-paper details, education, age, gender, etc., might be nearly identical to the person they replaced. But this newcomer could introduce subtle changes to the team dynamic, requiring a shift in strategy for certain projects. This is very similar to the sensitive dependence on initial conditions found in chaos theory. If a small change within a single case can have such an impact, then it becomes even harder to simply apply the same formula from one case to another. For instance, consider a company that scales up and the manager's team grows from 10 people to 100. While it's still the domain of management and some fundamentals remain the same, the strategies and organizational structure must change dramatically. Therefore, if a manager truly wants to master the art of management, they need exposure to a vast number of cases within that domain to build an exceptionally rich knowledge system. So how many cases are enough? How rich does this knowledge system need to be? If we simply resort to rote memorization, linearly adding cases to our knowledge base in the hope that we'll find an answer for any future problem, then no amount will ever be enough. We will always encounter new situations where our existing knowledge structures don't apply, especially since tiny initial differences can lead to vastly different outcomes. What's more important is the ability to decompose and recombine our previous cases. Decomposition is the process of breaking down existing knowledge, concepts, rules, or structures into their smaller, fundamental elements. This requires a deep and analytical understanding of a problem's essence. Recombination is then integrating these basic units in entirely new ways, unbound by the original framework, in pursuit of breakthrough, innovative forms. Only through this flexible creativity can we solve all sorts of unexpected problems. This is why in complex situations, there is likely no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution. Complexity demands constant innovation and adaptation. These cases have another critical attribute: fuzzy boundaries. The world we inhabit is an interconnected web of complexity with blurred lines. Therefore, management, as an ill-structured domain, has fuzzy boundaries. Any given team or project, as a case, also has fuzzy boundaries. For example, a client for a project might have a major shift in their decision-making because of a personal family matter, which in turn affects the company's actions. Or a key team member might suddenly be unable to come to work, forcing an immediate adjustment in strategy. In short, the act of management is open, not closed. There is no clear line defining what falls within its scope. To take another example, consider the game of Go. Although Go can produce incredibly complex variations during a match, its rules are simple and clear. Its domain of application is a well-defined, bounded board, and it has a single, explicit goal: win the game. In contrast, strategic confrontation between nations has fuzzy boundaries. Making decisions in that context requires analysis and trade-offs across multiple dimensions. The paths to resolving a problem are diverse, and it can be nearly impossible to know the optimal approach before events unfold. Sometimes, a novel idea can creatively solve the problem. Finally, the outcome of a conflict between nations cannot be judged in simple win/loss terms. It could result in war, but it could also lead to cultural fusion and exchange. Or, in the process of competing, both sides might develop more advanced technologies or systems, indirectly advancing human civilization. None of these outcomes can be described simplistically. Therefore, an ill-structured domain is the kind of thing that, if you want to understand it, you must approach it with multiple representations, multiple interpretations, multiple analogies, and multiple dimensions of analysis. Of course, people don't have infinite cognitive resources. The brain's energy is limited. This is why we have a natural tendency to understand the world through simplification. The most common example of this is the stereotype. While it may cause us to overlook valuable differences, it saves us a great deal of mental energy and increases efficiency. Whenever we are summarizing patterns from cases and deriving knowledge structures, we are necessarily simplifying. The only question is to what degree. What we must guard against is oversimplification, completely ignoring the complexity of a situation, forcibly applying a simple mental model to a complex reality, and refusing to adapt. This would be like applying a track and field mentality to playing soccer, a housekeeping mentality to corporate management, or a farmer's mentality to running a modern economy. All right, we've now outlined what ill-structured domain knowledge is and the kinds of scenarios it deals with. But what does this form of knowledge actually look like? We can be certain that it cannot be expressed in the same way as mathematics or logic. Those disciplines are far too rigid. Yet, ill-structured domain knowledge isn't some kind of mystical, incoherent rambling either. So what form does it take? Well, I won't keep you in suspense any longer. It takes the form of art. And those domains that don't initially seem artistic, like management, social interaction, warfare, or soccer, only begin to be perceived as art when they become deeply enmeshed with the ill-structured domain. In other words, when someone is merely good at the superficial, technical level of these activities, we don't tend to call it art. That stage is still about mechanical memorization and the accumulation of cases. It leans toward being well-structured. It is only when these activities begin to have divergent interactions with the complexity of society and of life itself, forming a holistic and integrated adaptability, that people will praise something for being done like an art. Let's try to arrange all of human knowledge on a spectrum according to this standard of complexity. At one extreme, the most certain, clear, and rigorous, we have logic and mathematics. They are exercises in pure symbolic deduction. Next come disciplines that rely heavily on mathematical tools, like physics and chemistry. Here, the demand for perfectly clear symbolic reasoning is relaxed. If the results of a calculation roughly match experimental observation, then the algorithm is considered a good tool for explaining reality. Moving further along, we find fields like economics, which use tools from mathematics and statistics, but also study the laws of society. A key difference between social laws and physical laws is the inability to conduct directly controlled, repeatable experiments. Consequently, the discrepancy between calculation and observation is larger, and this greater margin of error is widely accepted. After that, we have the various fields of social studies, including history, ethics, and so on. One thing these disciplines cannot escape is the inevitable output of subjective viewpoints. This is inherent to their nature because they operate so closely to the complex and fuzzy reality of the world. As a result, they contain both rigorous, objective argumentation and the expression of values. To put it simply, although scholars use meticulous research and well-documented evidence as support, they are all, in a sense, telling a story, constructing a narrative, and expressing a certain hope or vision. And now, we arrive at the far end of our spectrum, and that is art. Art is the form of human knowledge that operates closest to the complex and fuzzy reality of the world. This type of knowledge abandons any need for empirical proof. Everyone knows that Anna Karenina only existed in the mind of Leo Tolstoy, yet no one would deny that Anna is a real, flesh-and-blood person. In art, the real world merely provides the raw materials. The content is constructed entirely from the creator's subjective world. At the same time, what we experience from art is also open and multi-layered. When combined with the unique personal experiences of each viewer, everyone can form a different understanding. This is what's meant by the saying, "There are 1,000 Hamlets in 1,000 people's eyes." Next, I will analyze the specific characteristics of art in detail, breaking them down into the following points to demonstrate why art is the most archetypal form of ill-structured domain knowledge. 1. The boundaries of art. An ill-structured domain is a vast collection of interconnected cases held together by a structure that is complex and possibly in flux. It may have a center or a main theme, but this center cannot be plotted with precise coordinates. Rather, it's something we infer from a collection of relatively discrete and loosely associated points. Therefore, each ill-structured domain is embedded within the infinite world in its own unique way, and it possesses no clear boundary separating it from what it is not. In this respect, art aligns perfectly with the nature of an ill-structured domain. Art, too, has boundaries. Horizontally, no artist sets out to document every single thing that happens in the world. Vertically, art cannot depict an infinite level of detail. While some painters focus on extreme photorealism, achieving poor-level precision, this approach often draws scorn from viewers who see it as a lack of conceptual depth and creativity. We can say that art is always created with a certain tendency, and this tendency is what gives art its focus on a specific domain. Before creation even begins, there must be an initial starting point, which might be a single thought in the creator's mind. For example, Miguel de Cervantes may have thought, "Reality is cruel, which makes idealism tragic. The world is therefore absurd, and I must write something to express this." And from that, Don Quixote was born. Once the seed of an idea has sprouted, the creator begins to search the entirety of their life experience for suitable cases to match it. These might be a person they knew, an event they lived through, or a fleeting feeling. When these cases are organized according to a certain structure, a work of art takes shape. A poem, an essay, or a novel are all typical forms of this. Their central themes are often open to extensive debate. The implications of their language are so broad that, with proper justification, we can connect them to almost anything through associative interpretation. 2. Creative flexibility. In the first section, we said that a creator's job is to organize cases according to a certain structure. At the same time, art possesses a certain tendency from the very beginning. Therefore, another core component of artistic creation is the selection and rejection of various materials. We already know that knowledge from an ill-structured domain can rarely be applied uniformly to different cases. If we simply rely on mechanical memorization and linearly add to our library of cases, no matter how vast that library becomes, it will sometimes be impossible to extract a perfectly suitable knowledge structure for a dynamic situation. When we turn our gaze back to art, we find that artistic creation faces the exact same problem. Real-life objects, people, and events often do not perfectly align with the artistic image the creator intends to craft. This is why a creator needs not only a wealth of experience, but also the ability to decompose and recombine both their knowledge structures and the cases themselves. Likewise, the audience also needs to possess these abilities to better understand and appreciate different works of art. 3. The interpretive space of art. Now, let's shift our focus to the audience. We've said that the structure of art is loose and its boundaries are fuzzy. This very structure is what provides space for thought and imagination. When people appreciate a work of art, they feel that it has something it wants to express, but this expression is rarely explicit or direct. Instead, it is subtle and elusive, requiring the viewer to experience and piece it together for themselves. Many professional analysts work diligently to deconstruct a piece, attempting to excavate its core and find the words that can best explain it. People have invented many names for this core. At the most superficial level, they are the work's emotion, values, or worldview. Others, realizing this core cannot be captured in simple terms, call it the work's comprehensive concept. And then, some who recognize that a single center may not even exist have created a new term to replace it, the work's deep structure. The flaw in all of these perspectives, however, is that they are all searching for this artistic core as if it were something definitive and fixed. The structure of a work of art, where its boundaries lie, and what other domains it connects to, all of this is inevitably linked to the cognition of each individual viewer. Every person will have a different experience with the same work. In simple terms, there are 1,000 Hamlets in 1,000 people's eyes. We all hope to find our own Hamlet with clarity. The professionals in this endeavor are the film critics. A critic racks their brain not just for a personal, emotional response, but for an interpretation that will resonate with a wider audience and be seen as plausible. When a critic sets out to interpret a film, the knowledge they draw upon may include technical aspects like film production, screenwriting, lighting design, the language of montage, and psychology. But beyond that, they must also draw upon all facets of their life experience to create a more profound and convincing explanation. Otherwise, they will be seen as nothing more than a clumsy technician. Film criticism also demands imagination. It requires the ability to deconstruct one's own experiences and apply fitting metaphors and associations to form a vivid interpretation of the work. And yet, the resulting text of the critique is still more clearly structured than the artwork itself. Therefore, the act of interpreting art is, in essence, the act of imposing a simplified model onto an ill-structured phenomenon. Of course, another situation can arise. Viewers may experience certain feelings from a work and, upon getting the chance to speak with the creator, will naturally seek confirmation. However, they may not receive a completely satisfying answer. The artist might refuse to offer an overly explicit interpretation of their own work. This isn't done to be mysterious or to keep people in suspense. Rather, it is a conscious or unconscious resistance to absolute interpretation and oversimplification. Sometimes, the artists themselves may be lost in the complexity of their own creation. They might only have an intuitive sense that certain elements are connected, or a feeling that something just works better when placed in a certain spot, or that something feels not quite right when it's missing. For this reason, creators will refuse to extract a fixed formula from their work, precisely to preserve its space for interpretation. Conclusion. So let's summarize. What is art? Art is the archetypal form of knowledge applied to complex domains. And why is art the most archetypal? Because in art, subjectivity is paramount. Reality merely provides the raw materials. The true essence of the work lies in the creator's acts of organization and selection. To preserve its own internal coherence, art can almost completely dispense with a basis in reality. The root of all this lies in our fundamental premise, that the world is complex, chaotic, and ill-structured. In our next video, we will explore the relationship between art and beauty. In this video, we have largely used the best and most archetypal works as our benchmark to define what art is. But the phenomenon of art is diverse. There is great art, and there is also bad art. From the perspective of the audience, we naturally make judgments about whether art is good or bad. And the most important criterion for that judgment is the sense of beauty.